In a small, gritty city where crime was as common as the morning fog, two veteran police officers had built reputations that were hard to ignore. Detective James Hawk Hawkins and Officer Victor Malone weren't just known for their years on the force. They were infamous for bending the rules in ways most people couldn't even imagine. To the outside world, they appeared tough but fair, the kind of cops who got results no matter what it took. But behind closed doors, they were something else entirely: corrupt, greedy, and untouchable. Hawk and Malone had spent over a decade exploiting their badges for personal gain. They didn't just take bribes, they demanded them. Local shop owners paid them off every month to avoid trouble. If someone refused, they'd find themselves slapped with trumped-up charges or harassed, until they gave in. It wasn't just about money either. They thrived on power. Framing innocent people became second nature to them. Need a distraction from a botched investigation? Plant some drugs on a random person? Want to silence a nosy reporter? Fabricate evidence linking them to a crime. For Hawk and Malone, the law wasn't there to protect. It was a tool to control. One day, their sights landed on Maria Alvarez, a young single mother struggling to keep her bakery afloat. Maria worked tirelessly, waking up before sunrise to bake fresh bread and pastries for her customers. Her little shop was more than just a business. It was her lifeline, the only thing keeping her and her 8-year-old son afloat after losing her husband unexpectedly. Life hadn't been easy for Maria, but she always managed to push through, fueled by sheer determination and love for her child. But Maria's quiet life took a devastating turn when Hawk and Malone decided she was an easy target. One evening, while closing up her bakery, Maria noticed a suspicious car parked across the street. She thought nothing of it at first, assuming it was just another late-night customer. But moments later, 3 men burst into her shop, flashing badges and shouting accusations. Before she could process what was happening, they shoved her against the counter, handcuffed her, and began tearing apart her store. By the time they left, Maria was sitting in the back of a squad car, accused of possessing illegal drugs with intent to distribute. The drugs, of course, had been planted. Hawk and Malone had orchestrated the whole thing, confident that no one would question their story. After all, why would anyone doubt 2 decorated officers? And besides, Maria had no connections, no powerful friends to fight for her. In their eyes, she was perfect prey, someone whose life they could destroy without consequence. What Hawk and Malone didn't know, however, was that Maria wasn't alone. Her younger brother, Diego, had been watching from afar. Diego had grown up in the same neighborhood as Hawk and Malone, witnessing firsthand how they terrorized the community. He'd seen too many lives ruined by their schemes, and he'd vowed long ago to do something about it. That's why, years earlier, he'd approached the FBI and offered to work as an undercover informant. Since then, he'd been gathering evidence of their crimes, documenting everything from shady deals to outright abuses of power. Diego knew his sister was innocent, and he also knew exactly who was responsible for setting her up. As soon as he heard about her arrest, he sprang into action, reaching out to his contact within the FBI, Special Agent Rachel Monroe. Rachel was a seasoned investigator with a reputation for tackling cases others deemed impossible. She listened carefully as Diego laid out the details of Hawk and Malone's latest scheme, poring over the evidence he'd collected. When she realized the depth of their corruption, she made a decision. This case wasn't just about clearing Maria's name. It was about taking down the entire rotten system. As the trial date approached, Hawk and Malone remained oblivious to the storm brewing around them. They strolled into the courthouse that morning with cocky grins, convinced they'd skate through yet again. Their defense attorney had already assured them victory, spinning tales of misunderstandings and overzealous informants. The courtroom buzzed with tension, but Hawk and Malone barely paid attention. To them, this was just another routine hearing, a chance to flex their influence and remind everyone who really held the power. Maria sat nervously in the gallery, clutching her son's hand tightly. She tried to stay strong for him, but inside, she felt like her world was crumbling. Every glance at the defense table sent waves of anger and fear coursing through her veins. How could these men sit there so calmly, knowing full well they'd stolen her freedom, her dignity, her future? When the prosecution called its final witness, neither Hawk nor Malone expected anything unusual. They assumed it would be another low-level agent or perhaps one of those nervous bureaucrats who fumbled under pressure. Instead, a woman walked in who looked anything but ordinary. Dressed in a sharp suit, her presence commanded respect. As she took the stand, Hawk leaned over to whisper to Malone, "This chick doesn't scare me." Little did they know their arrogance was about to cost them dearly. Copy, ask, explain. The courtroom was tense, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like everyone is holding their breath. Hawk and Malone sat at the defense table, leaning back in their chairs with smug expressions plastered across their faces. They weren't just confident, they were cocky. After years of bending the system to their will, they'd come to believe they were untouchable. And why wouldn't they? Every time someone tried to stand up to them, they crushed them without breaking a sweat. When the prosecution called its final witness, Hawk raised an eyebrow. "This must be their big gun," he muttered sarcastically to Malone, who smirked in response. Neither of them looked particularly worried. To them, this was just another day in court, a chance to show off how clever they were and remind everyone who really held the power. The woman who stepped forward didn't seem like much at first glance. She wore a sharp suit, her hair pulled back neatly, and carried herself with a calm authority that immediately caught the room's attention. The prosecutor introduced her as Special Agent Rachel Monroe from the FBI. Hawk rolled his eyes when he heard the name. "FBI?" he whispered to Malone. "What do they know about street-level stuff like ours?" Rachel took the stand, her movements deliberate and measured. She glanced around the room, making brief eye contact with Maria, who sat nervously in the gallery. For a moment, Maria felt a flicker of hope. There was something about Rachel, her steady gaze, the way she carried herself, that made you believe she wasn't here to waste anyone's time. The questioning began, and almost instantly, it became clear that Rachel wasn't your average witness. She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully, each sentence landing like a hammer blow. She started with the basics, laying out the timeline of events leading up to Maria's arrest. But then she went deeper, pulling apart the lies Hawk and Malone had built piece by piece. "Detective Hawkins," Rachel said, turning slightly toward him, though her voice remained neutral, "can you explain why surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store shows you entering Ms. Alvarez's bakery hours before her alleged arrest, and leaving with a package that matches the description of the one containing planted evidence?" Hawk shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't expected anyone to dig that deep. His lawyer jumped in quickly, trying to object, but the judge allowed Rachel to continue. She pressed on, presenting photos, audio recordings, and even text messages between Hawk and Malone discussing their plans to frame Maria. Each new piece of evidence sent ripples through the courtroom. Gasps echoed from the gallery, and reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Malone leaned over to whisper to Hawk again, his earlier confidence starting to crack. "Where the hell did she get all this?" he hissed under his breath. Hawk didn't answer. Instead, he stared at Rachel, his jaw tightening. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to win, to walk away laughing like always. But Rachel wasn't done yet. As she continued, her tone shifted ever so slightly, not angry but firm, unyielding. She described the months-long investigation led by informants within the community, people who had grown tired of living in fear. She talked about the countless hours spent reviewing documents, tracking financial transactions, and piecing together the web of corruption that stretched far beyond just Hawk and Malone. "You've been operating above the law for years," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Planting evidence, extorting business owners, destroying lives, all in the name of lining your own pockets. But what you failed to realize is that no matter how powerful you think you are, there's always someone watching, someone willing to fight back." By now, Hawk and Malone were visibly uneasy. Their smirks had faded completely, replaced by nervous glances and fidgeting hands. Even their defense attorney seemed rattled, struggling to keep up with Rachel's Relentless presentation. The jury watched intently, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and disgust. It was becoming painfully obvious that these two men weren't the heroes they claimed to be. They were predators, preying on the vulnerable for their own gain. Maria clutched her son's hand tighter, tears streaming down her face. For months, she'd lived in fear, wondering if she'd ever see justice. Now, sitting here listening to Rachel dismantle the lies that had ruined her life, she felt a glimmer of hope returning. Maybe, just maybe, things would finally change. As Rachel wrapped up her testimony, she paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, in a move that left the entire courtroom stunned, she turned directly to Hawk and Malone. Her gaze locked onto theirs, unwavering and sharp. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Everyone waited, unsure of what she was about to say next. That's when Rachel dropped the bombshell. "I'm not just Special Agent Rachel Monroe," she said, her voice ringing out clearly, silencing every whisper in the room. "I am Director Rachel Monroe of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The effect was immediate. Gasps erupted from the gallery, and reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Hawk and Malone froze, their faces pale. All the color drained from their cheeks as reality hit them like a freight train. This wasn't some low-level agent they could intimidate or dismiss. This was the head of the entire FBI, standing right in front of them, exposing their crimes for the world to see. For the first time in their careers, Hawk and Malone looked truly afraid. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of papers, and the sharp intake of breath from nearly everyone present. Hawk and Malone sat frozen, their faces pale, as if they'd just seen a ghost. They weren't just shocked, they were terrified. The smug confidence that had carried them through so many trials was gone, replaced by raw panic. Rachel didn't waste a second. She leaned forward slightly in her chair, her eyes locked onto the two men like a hawk circling its prey. Her voice remained steady, calm, but there was an edge to it now, a tone that said she wasn't here to play games. "When I first took on this case," Rachel began, her words cutting through the tension like a knife, "I knew we were dealing with corruption. What I didn't realize was just how deep it ran." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "You didn't just frame an innocent woman. You didn't just ruin her life for your own gain. You've been exploiting your badges for years, using fear and intimidation to control an entire community." Hawk shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He glanced at his lawyer, hoping for some kind of lifeline, but the man looked just as lost as he did. Malone, on the other hand, stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. For the first time in their careers, they were powerless. Rachel pulled out a folder, filled with documents, photos, and transcripts. She flipped through them slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone in the room understood the gravity of what she was about to reveal. "This isn't just about Maria Alvarez," she said, holding up a photo of a local shop owner who had been forced to pay Hawk and Malone monthly bribes to keep his business running. "This is about every person you've extorted, every family you've destroyed, every lie you've told to cover your tracks." She placed the photo down and picked up another one, a grainy surveillance still showing the two officers meeting with a known criminal in a dimly lit parking lot. "And let's not forget the illegal deals you've made behind closed doors, deals that put innocent lives at risk while you lined your pockets." The judge, who had been quietly observing until now, leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing every word. In the gallery, Maria sat clutching her son's hand, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of vindication. After months of feeling helpless, she finally saw justice taking shape right before her eyes. Hawk tried to interrupt, his voice shaky as he blurted out, "This is all circumstantial. You can't prove any of this." But his protest came out weak, almost desperate. Even he didn't sound convinced. Rachel turned her attention directly to him, her gaze piercing. "Oh, I can prove it," she said, her tone icy but controlled. She held up a USB drive and waved it slightly for emphasis. This contains hours of recorded conversations between the two of you discussing your schemes. It has bank statements showing unexplained deposits matching the amounts you demanded from local businesses. And, she paused for dramatic effect, it includes testimony from multiple witnesses within the department who are ready to come forward and confirm everything. Malone's head snapped up at that. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for those so-called witnesses. Who would dare speak against them? They'd spent years silencing anyone who even hinted at dissent. But Rachel wasn't bluffing. Every piece of evidence she mentioned was real, meticulously gathered over months of investigation. As the weight of her words settled over the courtroom, Hawk and Malone exchanged a glance. There was no trace of camaraderie left between them, only betrayal. Each man seemed to be silently accusing the other of getting them into this mess. Their arrogance, once their greatest weapon, had become their downfall. Rachel wrapped up her testimony with a statement that sent chills down everyone's spines. "You thought you were untouchable," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "But no one is above the law, not even you." When she finished speaking, the room erupted into murmurs. Reporters whispered excitedly to each other, jotting down notes and snapping photos. Members of the public seated in the gallery exchanged looks of disbelief and satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, was finally catching up to the men who had evaded it for so long. Maria couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing softly as her son hugged her tightly. For the first time since her arrest, she felt like she could breathe again. All the sleepless nights, the fear, the humiliation, it was worth it, because now she knew the truth would come out. Meanwhile, Hawk and Malone slumped in their seats, defeated. Gone were the cocky grins, the dismissive attitudes. In their place was sheer desperation. They glanced at their lawyer, who was frantically flipping through papers looking for anything that might salvage their case. But even he seemed to know it was hopeless. The judge called for a recess, and as the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed outside, eager to share the story with the world. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust into people's faces, and questions flew fast and furious. Everyone wanted answers. How had two decorated officers fallen so far? Who was this mysterious FBI director who had single-handedly exposed their crimes? Back inside, Rachel met briefly with Maria and her brother Diego. Maria thanked her profusely, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you," she said, tears still streaming down her face. "You already have," Rachel replied gently, "by having the courage to fight back when so many others would have given up. That's what matters." Diego nodded, his expression a mix of pride and determination. Watching Rachel take down Hawk and Malone had inspired him in ways he hadn't expected. He realized then that he wanted to dedicate his life to fighting for justice, just like she did. As the day drew to a close, the mood in the courtroom shifted. What had started as a routine trial had turned into something much bigger, a reckoning. Hawk and Malone weren't just facing charges anymore. They were symbols of everything wrong with the system, and thanks to Rachel, their reign of terror was coming to an end. But Rachel knew this was only the beginning. Taking down two corrupt officers was one thing. Dismantling the larger network of corruption that enabled them was another challenge, entirely. As she walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting reporters, she allowed herself a small smile. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The verdict came quickly, almost too quickly for Hawk and Malone to process. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. They returned with a guilty verdict on all charges within an hour. When the judge read out the decision, there was a collective gasp in the courtroom. For Maria and her family, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off their shoulders. She hugged her son tightly, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe that justice had finally prevailed. But for Hawk and Malone, the moment was nothing short of devastating. As the bailiffs moved in to handcuff them, both men looked dazed, as if they were still trying to convince themselves this wasn't real. Their once impenetrable armor of arrogance had crumbled completely. Gone were the cocky smiles, the dismissive shrugs, the sense of untouchability. In their place was raw fear, fear of what awaited them behind bars. As they were led out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed around, shouting questions. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing every step of their humiliating exit. It was a scene neither man had ever imagined. Two decorated officers being paraded out, like criminals in front of a crowd hungry for accountability. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters shoved microphones toward anyone willing to talk. Family members, lawyers, even random passers-by who happened to be nearby. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Corrupt cops brought down by FBI director. Justice served for framed mother. End of an era for dishonest police. Social media exploded with reactions, from outrage over how long Hawk and Malone had operated unchecked to cheers, celebrating Rachel's bold move in court. People across the country tuned in, captivated by the story of how one woman and one brave community had taken down two of the most powerful figures in their city. Back at FBI headquarters, Rachel wasted no time basking in the victory. While on the trial had exposed the corruption of Hawk and Malone, she knew they weren't working alone. These men were just the tip of the iceberg. Someone higher up had likely been pulling strings, enabling their schemes and protecting them when things got dicey. Corruption rarely operated in isolation. It festered, spreading its roots deep into systems meant to protect and serve. Rachel gathered her team in a conference room, the walls covered with whiteboards filled with notes, photos, and maps. They reviewed everything they'd uncovered so far, piecing together connections between Hawk, Malone, and others in positions of power. Financial records showed suspicious transactions linked to city officials. Text messages hinted at meetings, with influential figures who could make or break careers. And then there were the whispers, rumors of a shadowy network of dirty cops, politicians, and business owners who worked together to exploit the system. We've made progress, Rachel told her team, pacing back and forth as she spoke. But we're not done yet. Taking down Hawk and Malone is just the first step. If we stop here, the cycle will continue. We need to dig deeper, root out everyone involved, and hold them accountable. Her words resonated with the agents in the room. Many of them had joined the FBI because they believed in justice, in making the world a safer place. Cases like this reminded them why their work mattered. They split into smaller groups, each tasked with investigating different leads. Some focused on tracking down more witnesses, while others combed through decades-old cases that might have been influenced by corruption. Every clue, no matter how small, was treated as a potential breakthrough. Meanwhile, Maria tried to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Being exonerated didn't erase the trauma of her arrest or the months she'd spent fighting to clear her name. Nightmares still woke her in the middle of the night, replaying the moment Hawk and Malone burst into her bakery and turned her world upside down. During the day, she poured herself into her work, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of kneading dough and baking bread. Her customers rallied around her, flooding her shop with support. Neighbors brought flowers, left encouraging notes, and spread the word about her business. Slowly but surely, Maria began to rebuild, not just her bakery, but her spirit. Her brother Diego stayed close, helping out whenever he could. Watching Rachel take down Hawk and Malone had ignited something inside him. He realized he wanted to fight for justice professionally, to stand up for people like his sister who couldn't defend themselves. He started researching law enforcement, careers, attending community meetings, and volunteering with organizations focused on police reform. Though he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every time he walked past the courthouse where Maria's trial had taken place, he reminded himself why he was doing this, to ensure no one else suffered the way she had. For Hawk and Malone, life behind bars was a harsh reality check. They were transferred to a maximum security prison, where news of their arrival spread quickly among inmates. Word got out that they were former cops, dirty ones at that, and resentment simmered. Prisoners muttered insults under their breath, glaring at them during meals and exercise hours. Even the guards seemed less sympathetic, treating them with cold indifference. For two men used to wielding authority, the loss of control was unbearable. At first, they clung to denial, whispering to each other late at night about appealing the verdict or finding some loophole to get them out. But as days turned into weeks, reality set in. Appeals were denied, legal fees piled up, and their families distanced themselves, ashamed of what they'd done. Alone and defeated, Hawk and Malone began to unravel. They argued constantly, blaming each other for their downfall. The camaraderie they'd shared for years dissolved into bitterness and regret. Despite their punishment, Rachel refused to let the case fade into obscurity. She gave interviews to national news outlets, using her platform to shine a light on systemic corruption and advocate for reform. She spoke passionately about the importance of transparency, accountability, and community involvement in policing. Her words struck a chord with millions of viewers, sparking conversations about how to build trust between law enforcement and the people they served. She also visited Maria personally, checking in to see how she was coping. Over coffee at Maria's bakery, they talked about the future. Rachel encouraged Maria to share her story, to speak out about the injustices she'd faced and inspire others to stand up against corruption. At first, Maria hesitated. She wasn't sure she was ready to relive those painful memories. But as she thought about it, she realized her experience could help others. If sharing her story prevented even one person from going through what she had, it would be worth it. By the time Rachel left the bakery, Maria felt a spark of determination she hadn't felt in months. She decided to host a community event at her shop, inviting local leaders, activists, and residents to discuss ways to improve relations with the police department. It was a small step, but it was a start. As the sun set over the city, Rachel stood on a hill overlooking the skyline, reflecting on everything that had happened. The battle against corruption was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Change was possible. It just took courage, persistence, and people willing to fight for it. And as long as there were individuals like Maria, Diego, and countless others standing up for what was right, the fight would continue. Months had passed since the trial, and the city was still buzzing with the fallout. The story of Hawk and Malone's downfall had become the talk of every dinner table, coffee shop, and community meeting. People who had once feared speaking out now found their voices growing stronger. For years, the two officers had operated like untouchable kings, ruling through fear and manipulation. But now their names were synonymous with disgrace. Their mugshots plastered across newspapers and TV screens served as a reminder that no one, not even those sworn to protect, was above the law. Rachel had kept her promise. She didn't stop at exposing Hawk and Malone. She pushed harder, determined to dismantle the web of corruption they'd been part of. Her team worked tirelessly, following leads, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together evidence that pointed to others involved in the scheme. It wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was about uncovering the cracks in the system that allowed such corruption to thrive in the first place. And slowly but surely, the truth began to surface. One by one, more names emerged. A city council member who had accepted bribes to turn a blind eye, a high-ranking police official who had covered up misconduct for years, even a few local business owners who had profited from shady deals with Hawk and Malone. Each revelation sent shockwaves through the community, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems they relied on every day. Some residents were angry, demanding immediate action. Others were skeptical, wondering if real change was even possible. But for the first time in years, there was momentum, a shared belief that something could be done. Maria's bakery became a hub for these conversations. What started as a small gathering quickly grew into weekly meetings where neighbors came together to discuss ideas for reform. At first, Maria felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, let alone leading discussions about policing and accountability. But Rachel had encouraged her, reminding her that her voice mattered. "You've lived this," Rachel had said during one of their talks. Your experience gives you insight that no report or statistic ever could. So, Maria stepped up. She invited activists, lawyers, and even a few open-minded police officers to join the discussions. Together, they brainstormed ways to rebuild trust between the community and law enforcement. Ideas ranged from implementing body cameras for all officers to creating civilian oversight boards that could review complaints against the department. Maria also suggested hosting workshops where residents and officers could sit down together, not as adversaries, but as partners working toward a common goal. Diego threw himself into the effort too. Inspired by Rachel's leadership, he decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. He enrolled in classes, studied late into the night, and shadowed officers who genuinely cared about serving their communities. It wasn't easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, especially when he heard stories about good cops being ostracized for standing up to corruption. But Diego reminded himself why he was doing this. He wanted to be the kind of officer his sister could trust, the kind of person who made the badge mean something again. As for Hawk and Malone, life behind bars only grew worse. Word of their crimes spread throughout the prison, earning them enemies among both inmates and staff. Former colleagues mocked them, calling them traitors to the uniform. Inmates whispered threats, blaming them for perpetuating the very injustices many had fallen victim to. Isolated and humiliated, the two men struggled to adapt to their new reality. They spent most of their time in silence, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. The cockiness that had defined them for so long was gone, replaced by shame and regret. But Rachel wasn't satisfied with simply punishing the guilty. She knew true change required addressing the root causes of corruption. That's why she organized a series of town halls, inviting residents, activists, and law enforcement leaders to come together and share their perspectives. These events weren't always smooth. Emotions ran high, and tensions occasionally boiled over. But Rachel remained patient, facilitating conversations that forced people to listen to each other. Slowly, bridges began to form. Officers admitted they didn't always have the resources or training to handle complex situations. Residents acknowledged that not all cops were bad, that some genuinely wanted to help, but felt trapped by a broken system. By the end of each session, there was a sense of cautious optimism, a glimmer of hope that things could get better. The media coverage amplified these efforts, shining a light on the grassroots movement taking shape in the city. Stories about Maria's resilience, Diego's determination, and Rachel's leadership inspired others across the country to take similar steps in their own communities. People realized that fighting corruption wasn't just the job of the FBI or government officials. It was everyone's responsibility. From parents organizing neighborhood watch programs to students advocating for policy changes, ordinary citizens began stepping up in extraordinary ways. Back at headquarters, Rachel continued spearheading investigations, determined to hold everyone accountable. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Taking down corrupt individuals was one thing, changing decades-old systems was another challenge entirely, but she refused to give up. Every morning she arrived at work with renewed focus, knowing that each case brought them closer to a fairer, more just society. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Rachel sat in her office, staring at photos pinned to a corkboard. There was Maria, smiling despite everything she'd endured. Diego looking hopeful as he studied for his exams, and countless others whose lives had been touched by this fight. Rachel allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The battle against corruption wasn't just about policies or procedures, it was about people, about giving a voice to the voiceless, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that justice wasn't just a word but a reality. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a deep breath. The work would never truly be done. There would always be new challenges, new battles to fight. But as long as there were people willing to stand up and say enough, progress was possible. And that, Rachel thought, was worth every sleepless night, every obstacle, every sacrifice. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled against the dark sky. Somewhere out there, Maria was baking bread, Diego was studying for his next exam, and countless others were finding strength in their shared struggle. Change was happening, one small step at a time. Months had turned into a year since the trial that changed everything. The city, once weighed down by fear and corruption, was slowly beginning to heal. Rachel's relentless pursuit of justice hadn't just exposed Hawk and Malone. It had sparked a movement. People who had lived in silence for years now felt empowered to speak out. Community meetings grew larger, drawing participants from all walks of life. Activists, teachers, business owners, and even former skeptics joined forces, united by a shared vision of a safer, fairer city. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, setbacks, and moments of doubt, but progress was undeniable. Maria's Bakery became more than just a place to buy fresh bread and pastries. It transformed into a symbol of resilience, a testament to what could be achieved when someone refused to give up. Her story resonated with so many people because it was relatable. She wasn't a politician or a celebrity. She was an ordinary woman who had faced extraordinary challenges. And yet she had risen above them, proving that courage and determination could overcome even the darkest odds. Customers lined up daily, not just for her delicious baked goods, but to support her mission. Some came to share their own stories of hardship, while others offered ideas for how to keep pushing forward. Maria listened to each one, grateful for the community that had rallied around her. Diego, meanwhile, had graduated from the police academy with honors. On his graduation day, he stood tall in his uniform, his chest swelling with pride as he took the oath to serve and protect. It was a moment filled with emotion, not just for him but for everyone who had supported him along the way. Maria sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her little brother step into a role that meant so much to him. Rachel attended too, quietly observing from the back of the room. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that Diego was part of the next generation of officers, ones committed to integrity and accountability. As Diego began his career, he quickly earned respect among his peers. He worked hard, showing up early and staying late to learn everything he could. But more importantly, he treated everyone with kindness and fairness, whether they were victims, suspects, or bystanders. His colleagues noticed. So did the community. Residents who had once avoided interactions with police now approached Diego willingly, trusting him to listen and help. It wasn't easy. There were days when he faced resistance from within the department, when old-school attitudes clashed with his modern approach. But Diego stood firm, reminding himself why he'd chosen this path. Rachel continued leading the charge against corruption, though her focus shifted slightly. While investigations into other corrupt officials were ongoing, she also turned her attention to systemic reforms. She traveled across the country, speaking at conferences and meeting with lawmakers about implementing policies that would prevent abuses of power. Transparency measures, independent oversight boards, and mandatory ethics training became cornerstones of her advocacy. Her speeches weren't just calls to action, they were personal appeals. She often shared Maria's story, emphasizing that real change started with listening to those most affected by injustice. At one such event, Rachel stood on stage before a packed auditorium. Law enforcement officials, politicians, and everyday citizens filled the seats, hanging on her every word. She spoke passionately about the importance of trust between communities and police departments. "Trust isn't given," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "It's earned. And it starts with accountability. We can't expect people to believe in us if we aren't willing to hold ourselves to the highest standards." The crowd erupted in applause when she finished. But Rachel didn't linger for photo ops or handshakes. Instead, she slipped backstage, checking her phone for updates from her team. Every case mattered, every lead counted. Even as she inspired others, Rachel remained grounded in the work itself, the painstaking process of gathering evidence, building cases, and ensuring no stone was left unturned. Back in the city, the ripple effects of Rachel's efforts were becoming clearer. New policies were being implemented within the police department, including stricter guidelines for handling evidence and increased penalties for misconduct. Training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, aiming to bridge gaps between officers and residents. Civilian oversight boards were formed, giving ordinary citizens a voice in how law enforcement operated. These changes weren't perfect. Some critics argued they didn't go far enough, but they represented a significant shift in mindset. For Maria, life had settled into a new rhythm. Her bakery thrived, thanks in part to the influx of support from the community. She hired additional staff, including a young single mother who reminded her of herself during those tough early days. Together, they created a warm, welcoming space where customers felt like family. Maria also made time to mentor others, sharing her experiences with groups working to combat injustice. She never shied away from talking about the pain she'd endured, believing that honesty was key to healing. One evening, Maria hosted a special event at her bakery to celebrate the anniversary of her exoneration. Friends, neighbors, activists, and even a few friendly officers gathered to mark the occasion. Rachel attended, bringing along Diego, who proudly wore his uniform. As they cut a celebratory cake decorated with the words, "Justice Prevails," Maria took a moment to address the crowd. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "There were times when I thought I'd lost everything. But what I learned is that none of us are alone. When we stand together, when we refuse to give up, we can create change. This bakery isn't just mine, it belongs to everyone who believed in me, who fought alongside me." Her words brought tears to many eyes, including Rachel's. For all her years of service, Rachel rarely let herself feel vulnerable. But tonight, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by this journey, she allowed herself to reflect on what it meant to truly make a difference. It wasn't about headlines or accolades. It was about relationships, trust, and hope. As the celebration wound down, Rachel pulled Maria aside for a quiet conversation. "You've done something incredible," Rachel said, her tone sincere. "You've shown people that they have power, that their voices matter. Don't ever stop using that power." Maria smiled, squeezing Rachel's hand. "I won't," she replied, "and neither will you." In the months that followed, the city continued to evolve. Challenges remained, of course. There were still bad days, moments when it felt like the weight of the world might crush them all again. But there were good days too. Days when a child waved at an officer instead of running away, when a neighborhood meeting ended with laughter instead of arguments, when a bakery owner saw her dreams come true despite the odds. Hawk and Malone faded into obscurity, their names reduced to cautionary tales. They served their sentences, isolated and forgotten, reminders of what happened when power went unchecked. Meanwhile, Rachel, Maria, Diego, and countless others carried the torch of justice forward, lighting the way for future generations. Change was slow, messy, and imperfect. But it was happening. And as long as there were people willing to fight for what was right, the city and the world would keep moving toward a brighter tomorrow.